Very good evening. You're watching Brass Tacks. I'm Akanksha Swaroop and we are coming live to you from the CNN News 18 and Federal Bank Prime Time studio. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Kiev today is the first by any Indian Prime Minister to Ukraine since it gained independence from the Soviet Union back in the year 1991. The meeting kicked off with both leaders visiting a memorial commemorating hundreds of Ukrainian children who have been killed during more than 2 years of war between Ukraine and Russia. It should be noted that the Indian Prime Minister has urged President Volodymyr Zelenskyy of Ukraine to sit down for talks with Russia and end the war. In fact, he has offered to act as a friend to help bring peace as the two leaders met in wartime Kiev. Even more so after Prime Minister Modi's recent visit to Moscow in July. Ukraine has seen the trip as an important opportunity for Kiev to put across its position on Russia's invasion to India, a country with traditionally close economic and defense ties with Moscow. Remember, the visit, even though historic, comes at a volatile juncture in the war ever since it began in February 2022. While Moscow has made slow gains in eastern Ukraine, Kiev too has pressed on a cross-border incursion in Kursk. So what is India hoping to achieve from this balancing act? That brings us to the question on Modi's peace pitch in Ukraine. Has the Indian Prime Minister scripted the art of diplomatic balance?
किसी भी समस्या का समाधान रणभूमि में कभी भी नहीं होता है। समाधान का रास्ता बातचीत से ही निकलता है। बम बंदूक और गोलियों के बीच समाधान और शांति वार्ताएं सफल नहीं होती हैं और हमने वार्ता के माध्यम से ही शांति के रास्ते अपनाने होंगे।
All right, let me introduce our esteemed panelists today. I'm joined in by S.T. Tiwari, who is a former Indian ambassador to Ukraine, Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky, who is a Ukrainian MP, Mr. Brahmachalani, who is a renowned strategic affairs expert, and Peter Zalmayev, who is a senior journalist joining us live from Kiev. Many thanks to you, gentlemen, for joining in. Mr. Tiwari, if I could talk about, do you see this as a balancing act? Something that, sort of surprises me. I see it rather as an extension of a balancing act, because let's not forget that India had already mediated on the crisis at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We have also helped in brokering that Black Sea grain deal that happened, not to forget all the medical aid that has been provided already by India. Do you actually see this as a balancing act, or India has already had that kind of engagement with Ukraine?
Well, I would think it is not just a balancing act. It has gone, I think, a stage beyond. President Zelensky wanted to normalize relations with India after Prime Minister's Moscow visit. And on our part, we also, for our own strategic interests, the kind of damage that this war has done to India, Indian economy, and globally also, and to be consistent with what Prime Minister has been saying in Moscow to President Putin, he also wanted to visit Kiev. So I think this visit is therefore much more than just a symbolic visit. And Prime Minister underscored the importance of peace. He made a very important statement that India was not neutral. India had taken sides and taken the side of peace. And also indicated that India is prepared to do much more above and beyond what it has done. We'll try to facilitate the resolution of this conflict. So I think a basic ground has been sort of prepared.
Right.
Good thing is a kind of a contribution to a possible conversation in the future between the two warring parties.
Right.
It's not a mediation or anything, but it is just I think, a very sincere approach.
Totally, and that is something Dr. S. Jaishankar already established today, that the offer has been made. We are there to help, and our focus is on the offer to mediate, perhaps not so much on the process of it. Mr. Ariev, do you think, now considering that the war is entered such a critical juncture, considering there is the Kursk incursion, is that also one of the crucial factors which will determine peace prospects and India's role as a prospective peacemaker?
Well, I'm really very upset about any kind of future negotiation, peace with Russia, direct for Ukraine, as well as we don't trust Russia at all, because in its history, Russia never hold their promises given by oral or signed. It's no matter which form it had. So I do believe that such states like India, and India, its the biggest world democracy, could have a really serious impact to the Russian way of conduct against all its neighbors, which we see the Moscow policy is to undermine their neighbors and then to undermine the current world security system. And of course, it's in vital interest of India to secure peace and to take and to give a lot of contribution, a possible contribution to the established peace. And I do believe that India, as a post-colonial state, which develops since the getting independence in a very, very successful manner, will be in good understanding Ukraine, which got an independence from Russia 33 years ago. Tomorrow
But Mr. Ariev, what explains the need for a peace summit if there's such a massive trust deficit between Kiev and Moscow?
You know that if you want to secure the peace, you have to be prepared for a war. So Russia understands only the language of the force and language of the strength. This is in its history, and if you don't have a good and strong position before negotiations, you will definitely lose every kind of negotiations. And Ukraine now should to establish a very firm and successful platform from which it will be starting possible negotiations.
All right. Professor Chelani, the United States and the West collectively have often implored India to openly condemn the war, something that the Prime Minister has abstained from doing. But, you know, going by that trust deficit that I just highlighted between Moscow and Kiev, how much do you think rests upon India's role as a peacemaker?
Well, there are two things here. That first, India has been trying to pursue a very calibrated approach. It's been trying to calibrate its relations with the warring sides in the Ukraine conflict. It's been trying to present itself as a possible go-between, because any ceasefire deal cannot be achieved quickly. It'll require lengthy and tough negotiations. But if you want a comprehensive and just peace, ceasefire is the first step. And to get a ceasefire, you need to talk. Right now, the warring sides are not talking to each other. Unfortunately, Modi's visit to Ukraine is as ill-timed as his visit to Moscow. His Moscow visit coincided with the NATO summit in Washington, and the Biden administration was clearly annoyed by the timing of Modi's visit to Moscow. And now Modi's visit to Kyiv has coincided with the Ukrainian military incursion into Russia, and the incursion has seriously set back ceasefire efforts, raising the question as to what India can achieve by engaging the warring sides at this time. And yet, we should not forget, and I know there was also very strident criticism of India by Zelensky today at his news conference. He accused India of helping to fill Russia's coffers through its imports of Russian crude oil. The reality is this: Europe's rising gas imports are contributing much more to Russia's coffers than India's oil purchases. And European countries are close allies. They are providing weapons to Ukraine. So Zelensky should be asking his European allies to stop importing Russian gas. India is buying Russian oil. Why? Because there are no Western sanctions on Russia's petroleum exports.
Yes.
Unlike on Iranian oil, India has been fully compliant with US-led sanctions on Iranian oil, which is much cheaper than Russian oil. So Zelensky's criticism today of India, both on the issue of oil imports and on India's UN votes, both were misplaced. You asked me about Western pressure on India to take sides in the Ukraine conflict. We should not forget that the West has not taken India's side in the ongoing border conflict with China. The United States has not said a word under Biden. Biden has not uttered a word on the ongoing confrontation between China and India, and yet they want India to take sides in a conflict in which India has no dog in the fight.
Peter, I'd like to bring you in. We've seen the condemnation actually coming from the Ukrainian president more vociferously, something that also happened when the Prime Minister was visiting Moscow. We also know that the NATO summit was on, but we've never heard that kind of acknowledgement whenever Indian aid has reached Ukraine. Today has been highlighted that over the last 2 years, India has already sent 17 medical consignments to Ukraine. The External Affairs Minister has also highlighted how we've played a role in the mediation of the crisis that took place at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, in also mediating that Black Sea grain deal with the help of Turkey as well. But the acknowledgement is never there. The condemnation certainly is.
Well, that's true, indeed, that our diplomats really have some ways to go to learn, how to appreciate all the help that we get, not just from our Western allies, but from countries of the global South. I think that Narendra Modi's visit to Kyiv is a first such major step in the right direction. As it's been noted, this is a historical visit, the first visit by a Prime Minister of India to Ukraine, as far as I understand, ever. This is very obviously important. India has done quite a bit, even though, if you ask me, it's done more to actually prop up Putin's war machine. And this is something for India to decide when and if it will finally decide to cut off that relations. We're not naive, and we do not believe this will happen in the near future. We also understand this is a very delicate balancing game in the region, considering that China is involved very heavily. And so I think part of the reason that Mr. Modi is between a rock and a hard place is that he does not want to see Russia gravitate any further into the hands of China, and that actually will happen, and it is happening precisely because Vladimir Putin remains fixated on this ridiculous war against Ukraine, becoming more and more dependent on China. So I think this is very important, and Modi is also showing that India is not going to be anyone's puppet, that Putin shouldn't take its relations for granted, that Washington and the West also remain very, very important players for India. And, we know the Prime Minister is continuing his trip elsewhere, Poland and some Western European countries.
In fact, it is his second European tour. He was very much in Austria along with that Moscow visit that he made last month itself. Good points made by Peter over there. And if I could bring in Ambassador Devari. Ambassador, I think what Peter is saying is very much in alignment with the view of multipolarity that we endorse. Because if Russia needs China, India needs Russia as much as perhaps the West needs India to counterbalance China in the Asian subcontinent. What is the harm if India is following that view of multipolarity?
Well, India, in the post-Soviet disintegration period, hasn't really looked closely towards Eastern Europe. Relations with Poland or other Eastern Europe countries have remained very marginal up till now. Perhaps because of this same apprehension that we might have had, that if you do that, Russians may not like it, given our close relations with Russia. So what is now being done, I think, in this situation, when India is now opening up to Central European countries, just as Russia does with China. Russia has close relations, growing relations with China. We could also have relations with countries in Eastern Europe. But in this whole issue, I find both, apart from Russia, there are two elephants in the room, and they are very large ones. One is China and another is the United States. I think what actually will be the course of war between Russia and Ukraine will be also influenced by the thinking of these two major countries. And we have the American election now coming up in November. So the results of that election also will have I think, a defining influence on what's going to be happening here.
That's a very crucial point. In fact, it's not just going to be the position where the war has, in fact, the point where the war has reached, but also the US election. But Mr. Ariev, I'd like to bring you in on this very point. The fact that the US has been very critical of India's own bilateral relationship with Russia. Is the West also forgetting that, you know, if we have energy needs which are being sufficed by Moscow, is also perhaps because of the global disruptions that we are currently seeing that have been caused by the wars in Ukraine, and not to forget, of course, in Gaza as well?
Well, I see now the world is going to be split between the countries who are adherents to the democracy and democratic values, and states who are not respecting democracy and trying to break down the current world security and political system. I'm pretty sure that Indian as democratic states, not in the company with by political mood, let's say it so, with China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and of course India has its own foreign policy, which based on national interest. But at the same time, I do believe that the respect to territorial integrity to Ukraine will be reflected in the future voting of India in United Nations institutions. Before, we see that India abstained of accusing Russia, making its own policy towards Russia. But I think now it's a time to choose, and this time is upcoming, which side every state will be chosen in the world. I don't see any kind of steps back for trying to create a bipolar world and to split the all countries between two camps.
All right.
So
Professor Chelani, if one were to also focus on Russia now, do you think that Russia, how in fact would you assess Russia's reaction? So far we've heard nothing coming in from Moscow. Do you even anticipate a reaction, or is it just because we have time-tested ties that will only work in favor of Prime Minister Modi?
Well, I'm sure that President Putin has welcomed Modi's Ukraine visit. Modi must have discussed his Ukraine trip with Putin in Moscow. So this must not be something that Modi has done without bringing Russia into the loop. If India wants to play the role of a mediator or go-between, it has to build trust with the warring parties, and this trip couldn't have happened out of the blue. Both Washington and Moscow would be in the loop. But my bigger concern is this: the longer this war rages, the greater the devastation Ukraine will face. Already 1/5 of Ukraine is under Russian occupation. Many young males of Ukraine have lost their lives. Many of those who are fighting on the front lines in Ukraine are men in their 40s. The demographic profile of Ukraine is changing. In this war, Russia is a loser. Ukraine, of course, is facing great devastation. But even the United States, by sapping its strength, by exposing its shortcomings, military shortcomings, for example, is not able to produce sufficient munitions for Ukraine. By exposing those military shortcomings and by sapping its strength, it could also eventually be a loser. There's only one winner in this war, and that one winner is China. China is accumulating greater economic and military strength. It's trying to play both sides. And I think it's very important for India's own security that India do whatever it can to help bring this war to an end.
But Professor Chelani, what are those good offices that China has utilized in sort of floating in a peace plan which India is not able to?
Well, China has only talked of peace without floating a plan, without proposing something concrete. India is very much in the action. India is talking to all sides. In fact, the road to a ceasefire in Ukraine lies through Washington. India is fully engaged with Washington about a possible ceasefire plan in the Ukraine conflict. The problem is this, that right now, the United States is in the midst of a presidential election, and only that election will determine clarity in American policy. Had Modi decided to visit, say, Ukraine in December, there would have been better clarity in terms of American policy and whether India's role or India's overtures could make a difference in this conflict.
Peter, when we talk, today at the External Affairs Ministry's press conference also that was addressed, there was a question raised in terms of whether China's peace plan also surfaced during the talks. And of course, India was very guarded and cautious. It said that it leaves Ukraine to decide that. How is Ukraine now expected to react in terms of the peace overtures that are being made by New Delhi under the aegis of Prime Minister Modi? As Professor Chelani just now highlighted, the good offices that New Delhi shares with not just Moscow but also Washington. Don't you think that makes India a more reliable partner in terms of dialogue and diplomacy?
I think India is definitely showing political will. The Prime Minister is showing that he understands that there's a greater need for India as it's accumulating greater economic and political heft in the world. It's really the today in Kiev when the Prime Minister is visiting our capital, but the simple fact, and my friend Mr. Aryev, the member of our just not shown his political will to offer Ukraine any sort of genuinely acceptable conditions for peace talks. His conditions remain: Ukraine capitulate, Ukraine downsize its army to about 80,000 or even less, Ukraine commit no membership in NATO, etc. These are not workable ideas. This will essentially make Ukraine into a new Belarus, a country with no real independence. And these are not peace negotiations, peace conditions on which we are able to.
All right, Mr. Ariev, I'm sorry, I'm running short of time, and that's why I'd like to just give you a quick minute to have your closing thoughts before I go back to Ambassador for his closing thoughts. Where do you see the potential roadblocks? Is it just Vladimir Putin?
Well, you know that Putin should understand that the war brings him any profit anymore. And moreover, he should feel that the war ruins its own country. And this could be a starting point for negotiations. And the rest of the world should understand that Russia promised always to defend and not to attack Ukraine, signing obligations when Ukraine stripped down voluntarily from nuclear weapon.
All right.
And now the world should always remind Putin that that very important step that Ukraine made for world security system. And I do believe that the pressure on Putin will be successful enough. It will be if it will be organized.
All right, Ambassador Devari, we all know that you're looking at a potential nuclear threat as well, something that Vladimir Putin's already made in the past. But does the buck just stop with Russia? Many political analysts have also shelved hopes on a different election outcome in the United States.
Well, even if the Republicans were to come to power in the United States, and if they decide on the change of direction, I think there is the factor of fatigue in the United States already set in now. So also in Europe. So even when the Democrats were asking for larger funding for Ukraine, it took several months before the Congress agreed. So I think it's not going to be so simple. I think there will be considerable difficulty in pursuing this pursuing the Ukraine policy for the United States.
All right, Professor Chelani, your closing thoughts.
There's only one possible solution. I put in quotes. Solution to this Ukraine conflict. A NATO-Russia agreement on Ukraine modeled on the 1955 treaty, under which Austria established itself as a de facto buffer state between the East and West and declared its quote-unquote perpetual neutrality, including committing not to allow the stationing of foreign troops on Austrian soil. This led to the ratification of the Austrian Independence Treaty in the same year, and a perpetual neutrality clause is still enshrined in the Austrian constitution. That is the only way forward to end this conflict, because this conflict is bleeding not just Ukraine, it is impacting the entire world.
We certainly do hope India can utilize its famed non-alignment approach, something that it has been known for, especially when it comes to balancing that tightrope walk between two competing blocs. Many thanks to you, gentlemen, for joining in on CNN News 18 with your precious inputs here on Brass Tacks. And with that, we now shift focus over to Jammu and Kashmir. This after Congress and the National Conference sealed the alliance for the assembly elections in the valley. The Congress party has maintained that its focus is the restoration of statehood in Jammu and Kashmir. The Congress is, however, silent on the contentious manifesto promises of the